Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a great turnout today. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition at Yale University. Welcome back to various of our guests out there and anyone who's new. My colleague, Associate Director Michelle Zaks, will be putting, I think, a variety of announcements into the chat. And one of them will surely be the reminder of our big conference, our annual conference, November 3 to 5, here at Yale, in person, in Luce Hall, on the, we think, timely subject of teaching race and slavery in the American classroom. We've worked very hard on this. We are making teachers themselves the showcase, the centerpiece of the conference. There will be 2 whole sessions with American teachers from various parts of the country. There will also be breakout sessions with teachers and the lunch periods and a variety of other star-studded panels on a subject our culture is much vexed with, and we really look forward to it. We've had an enormous response already to the idea of the conference, and the public is welcome, but you're going to have to sign up soon because we may have a limited capacity due to a few COVID rules. But anyway, that's November. It's a thrill today to have back with us Martha McNamara, who was our visiting fellow last spring. She's on that list of people we have at the GLC now and then as fellows who we always call a keeper because we would love to have her stay. But she had to go back to her job, which is the Department of Art at Wellesley College, where she runs a New England Center for Art. She did her graduate work at BU. She was an undergraduate, did her BA at Wesleyan up in Middletown. She's the author of numerous articles all over the landscapes. But she's also the author of the book From Tavern to Courthouse: Architecture and Ritual in American Law in 2004. She's the author of Amateur Movie Making: Aesthetics of the Everyday in New England Film. Actually, that's I believe an edited volume she did with a colleague. She's working on 2 manuscripts, one called New England's Prospects: Landscape Representation in Word and Image, from 1750 to 1850, and this project that we're going to hear about today. And I must say, an extraordinary story, one of those stories that sometimes just happens to a scholar and happens because that scholar knows where to look. Tovookan's story, pictorial autobiography and abolitionist narrative in Antebellum America. Wait till you hear this tale, my friends. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to Martha. Martha, welcome back to our first of the fall semester Wednesday. We used to call them brown bags. I think what do we call them now? Wednesdays at the GLC or something like that. Anyway.
Zoom lunches.
Zoom lunches, exactly. And thank you, Martha, and welcome back. And I'll let you explain who that photograph was of you a bit earlier. Martha, welcome. It's all yours.
Thanks so much, David. That photograph was my husband. I'm borrowing his computer, so he popped up on the screen. I had no idea that was going to happen. But thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin with the graphic for the talk. So thank you, David, and thank you to all the GLC team for a wonderful, what ended up being 8 weeks down at Yale. I particularly want to thank Michelle Zaks for being so welcoming and so helpful, getting me organized with all the various Yale systems. I want to thank Melissa McGrath, who put together, among other things, helping me put together this wonderful graphic for my talk today. I want to thank Tom Thurston for lots of great conversations and also for being so patient with my many, many bibliographic inquiries. And thanks to Daniel Vieira, who's so efficiently running tech for us today. It was a great 8 weeks at the Gilder Lehrman Center, super productive and really lovely to be there. Okay, so today I'm going to speak with you about a project that I worked on while at the Gilder Lehrman Center, and it's a book-length study of an African artist living in Western Maine in the 1850s. It focuses particularly on an 1856 watercolor drawing on cotton that he produced to tell the harrowing story of his ensnarement in the transatlantic slave trade. And that's what you're seeing on the screen right now. The artist's African name was Tovookan. He was given the name Pedro by a Portuguese slave trader and gets the last name of Paris from the Maine family whose household he ultimately joins. Now, most records refer to him as Pedro or as Pedro Paris, but I will refer to him with the double name of Pedro Tovookan in order to retain his African identity. And interestingly, it's also the name Pedro Tovookan that the Paris family puts on his grave marker when he dies in 1860. Now, the banner records his experiences in the Atlantic world in 3 vignettes. And the first, so reading left to right in the banner, the first shows Rio de Janeiro, whereas a 12-year-old Pedro Tovookan was brought from East Africa to be sold into slavery in 1845. The second vignette is of a ship, possibly representing his transport to New England to testify against the American ship captain who had carried him to South America. The third vignette is a view of Boston, Massachusetts, and I'll try and use my cursor here to show you that piece of it, coupled with an image of the Western Maine farm where he lived with the Paris family. Now, the banner is a really unusual format. It's 6 feet long by 18 inches high. And as I said, it's watercolor on cotton. And I hope you can tell from this image that I'm standing up on a ladder and taking a photograph of it facing down so you can get a sense of the scale of the object. Now, what I find so fascinating about this object is not only that it's a pictorial narrative of Pedro Tovookan's experiences of the transatlantic slave trade, but also because it adopts the conventions of mid-19th century commercial imagery, specifically that of moving panoramas, which were itinerant pictorial exhibitions that told stories or sort of took you on a trip through a linear progression of images. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the paper. Now, Pedro Tovookan's choice of a panoramic format to tell essentially his life story with its representation of movement through time and space, mirrored his own movement through the Atlantic world. It reveals his perceptions of unfamiliar places like Rio and New England, but it also reveals the ways in which popular imagery of the time structured his narrative. Now, it's been surprising to me just how much information I've been able to uncover about Pedro Tovookan's experiences. I found information about him in diplomatic correspondence, photographs, court records, personal diaries, and newspapers. But the most important piece of evidence is a memoir of Pedro Tovookan's life, written by Percival Paris, the youngest member of the household that Pedro Tovookan joined in the late 1840s. Now, Percival was born in 1849 and was 11 years old when Pedro Tovookan died. And I think that they had a close, almost brotherly kind of relationship. I think Pedro Tovookan was kind of like an older brother to him. It was a family of 4 children. He had 2 older brothers, but I think he was particularly close with Pedro Tovookan. Now, Percival, as an old man, he lived into his 90s, recorded what he knew of Pedro Tovookan's life. And so this memoir obviously has its problems as a source. So this is, a 90-year-old man writing probably in the 1920s about what he remembers from when he was 11 of stories that were told to him by his close childhood companion. So it's got problems. Some of what he says in the memoir is demonstrably wrong. A lot of it is racist, but it also provides key information that we could not have uncovered otherwise. So it's super useful for that reason. Now, the story of Pedro Tovookan's enslavement begins, as I said, in East Africa in 1845. And of course, that's very unusual because most of the transatlantic slave trade operated out of West Africa. It's hard to know exactly where he came from. And actually, the work that I did as a visiting fellow at the GLC really helped me to uncover a lot more of the African side of his story. And I'm working now to incorporate that, that material into the project. So it's still not clear where he came from, but it was somewhere in the southern coastal hinterland of Mozambique, somewhere down here near what's currently the capital of Mozambique, Maputo. Now, according to Percival's memoir, Pedro Tovookan was kidnapped in a raid on his village and with at least one of his brothers sold to a Portuguese slave trader who gave him the name Pedro and taught him to speak Portuguese. He was sold again and transferred to a slave trading station in Lourenço Marques, which again is now called Maputo. And that slave trading station was run by Manuel Pinto da Fonseca, one of the principal slave traders in Rio de Janeiro during the 1840s. Now, of course, the slave trade was outlawed by the United States and Britain in 1807, but Brazilians continued the trade and actually profited from its abolition elsewhere. They were able to move in as the US and Britain sort of retreated from the slave trade. The Rio slave traders often hired American ships to transport enslaved people or to act as tenders for larger slaving vessels. The tenders were typically smaller and faster than the larger slaveholding ships and were meant to decoy any British men of war looking to suppress the slave trade. And these men of war were patrolling, not very effectively, actually, but they were patrolling both the east and west coast of Africa. The American ship, the Porpoise, commanded by Cyrus Libby of Scarborough, Maine, was one of those tenders that was hired by Fonseca, the slave trader. Now, Pedro Tovookan and another boy with the Portuguese name of Guilherme boarded the Porpoise in Lourenço Marques and sailed with the Kentucky, also a Maine ship, to Rio, and perhaps one or two other ships in a kind of caravan or flotilla to Rio. I haven't found a picture of the Porpoise, but this is a picture of the Kentucky. Now, once in Rio, the Porpoise's crew, who were really upset by both the long voyage and the captain's harsh treatment of them, turned Cyrus Libby into the American Consul General for slaving when they got to Rio. That man was named George Gordon, and Gordon, with the help of the commander of the American naval ship, the USS Raritan, that was stationed in Rio's harbor, took possession of the Porpoise and sent the ship, Captain Libby, the crew, and the two African boys to Maine, where Captain Libby would stand trial for the federal crime of slave trading. The case came to trial in Portland, Maine in 1846. Libby pleaded not guilty. He claimed complete ignorance of what was going on and testified that he thought the boys were free and being transported to Rio, quote, to be educated and sent back to the coast. The Maine jury acquitted Libby on the grounds that there was not enough evidence to prove that he had actually been intentionally slaving. But they probably also acquitted him because punishment for slave trading was the death penalty. And that meant that American juries were super reluctant to convict people for slaving. Now, after the trial, Pedro Tovookan and Guilherme is called now either William or Billy, they were free, but they had very few options. They were in Portland, Maine. They could have shipped out on one of the merchant sailing ships or worked on the wharves, but they were only about 14 years old. So what happens is that Pedro Tovookan joins the household of Maine lawyer and politician Virgil Paris, who had participated in the Libby trial, and Billy was sent to live in New Hampshire with a relative of the judge who sat on the case. Now, the Paris family lived in Portland, Maine, which had a population of about 10,000 people, until 1851, when they moved 50 miles inland to the county seat town of Paris, Maine. And this is an amazing early daguerreotype, 1846, of Portland, of the it's essentially the main commercial street in Portland. And I have pored over this image to see if I could somehow spot Pedro Tovookan in there. Wouldn't that be great? So Paris, Maine was where the Paris family confusingly moved to. The Paris family, their name is spelled with 2 R's. Paris, Maine is named after the European capital. But here is Portland down here on the coast, and then Paris, Maine is up here about 50 miles northwest. So it was a rural community, but it was also a central place because it was a county seat. And as you can see in this map, this is a map of the railroads. It was connected with to Portland by the railroad. Now, Pedro Tovookan must have been an unusual presence in this western Maine town. There was a small community of African Americans in Portland, but as 3rd or 4th generation descendants of enslaved people from West Africa, I don't think they would have had much in common with the East African teenager. And surely no one in Paris, Maine in the 1840s and 50s spoke Portuguese. But Pedro Tovookan seemingly fit in with both the Paris family and their rural Maine community. At his death in 1860, the local newspaper, the Oxford Democrat, printed a laudatory obituary, while a neighbor of the Paris family recorded in her diary, quote, "Pedro was a great favorite with all. He had not one enemy. The children in the family are inconsolable." Excuse me, it's not COVID, it's a cold. These remembrances are an important context for the watercolor drawing. I think Pedro Tovookan must have been a very charismatic person and possibly a natural storyteller. And that may explain why 10 years after the trial of Captain Libby, the diplomat George Gordon, who had sent Pedro Tovookan to New England and was then running for governor of Massachusetts on an anti-slavery platform, Gordon remembered the 2 African teenagers and brought Pedro Tovookan and Billy to Massachusetts to campaign for him. And this is an ambrotype of Pedro and Billy. Billy is on the left and Pedro is on the right. And I think that this was taken in Boston in 1856, where they would have reconnected. And again, it's just an example of the extraordinary wealth of material that I've uncovered for this about Pedro. So it seems then that the banner was drawn by Pedro Tovookan to help him tell his story as he stumped for George Gordon in the 1856 Massachusetts gubernatorial race. Pedro reportedly spoke English with difficulty, and I think maybe used this as a prop. So the banner is not just an autobiography, but it's also a political narrative meant to boost Gordon's anti-slavery credentials. Gordon was a member of the notoriously xenophobic American Party, also called the Know Nothings, who had swept aside the Massachusetts Whigs in the 1854 elections. And by 1856, the American Party had splintered in Massachusetts had splintered with pro-abolitionist members defecting to the newly formed Republican Party, leaving the more conservative, compromise-oriented faction to support George Gordon for governor. Gordon's platform aligned with the National American Party candidate for president, Millard Fillmore, and stressed containment of slavery and preservation of the Union at all costs rather than abolition. Gordon's decision to enlist Pedro Tovookan and Billy in his campaign, therefore, represented a relatively safe choice, anti-slavery, without the taint of sectionalism. Republicans saw right through this attempt to walk the line on slavery, and Boston's newspaper, the Republican newspaper, the Daily Atlas, recorded Pedro Tovookan's appearances, and the racist coverage ridiculed Gordon for being, quote, compelled to invoke the oratorical powers of Pedro Paris Esquire, a native African, when the know-nothings had talked so much and so sarcastically of woolly heads and were so fearful of everything foreign. Given its use as a visual prop in Gordon's campaign, the gaps in Pedro Tovookan's pictorial narrative now make sense. There are no images of his time in Africa or of his experience of the Middle Passage. So it's missing a big piece of his, if we see it as an autobiography, it's missing a big piece of his life story. Instead, the banner focuses largely on the legal context that defined Pedro Tovookan's status as either free or enslaved. His story begins in Rio de Janeiro at precisely the moment when the state, in the guise of George Gordon, intervenes in his captivity. So knowing that, we can now reread the watercolor. From left to right, again, the first images of Rio de Janeiro and of a ship are the key moments. George Gordon's legal and political intervention in Brazil and the transportation of Captain Libby and witnesses to New England. The city of Boston, Massachusetts, where the porpoise landed, is signified by the golden dome of the Massachusetts State House, right up here. Another symbol of political power, and Boston is situated adjacent to a recognizable rendition of a New England farmstead. And it's interesting to me that the farmstead is the only image that's populated with clearly and particularly delineated figures. Now, most notable about this last image are the two figures standing like sentinels as gateposts at the entrance to the farmstead. And you can see them over here on either side. And this is a close-up detail. They are possibly Virgil Paris on the left and his wife, Columbia Rawson Paris. And there's a carte de visite of Virgil Paris. And I think it corresponds quite nicely with the image on Pedro Tovookan's watercolor. There's also an oversized female figure in the front yard over here, and then a boy, possibly Percival, in a pony cart entering through the farmstead gate. The focus of the banner then is clearly on the political and legal context of his captivity and freedom. Now, rather than adopting a campaign banner's traditional square format, like these anti-slavery banners painted about the same time, the horizontal orientation and sequencing of images in Pedro Tovookan's banner instead relates it closely to moving panoramas, commercial entertainments that first appeared in the US in the early 19th century and became wildly popular in the 1840s. The first panoramas were displayed in London in the 1780s, and these early ones were actually stationary. They were large circular paintings designed to be seen from a central platform in a purpose-built structure. So this is Robert Barker's early panorama in Leicester Square, London. And you can see there's a platform here and a panorama on the lower level, and then if you paid more, you could go up to this platform and see yet another panorama. And the idea was that you were sort of immersed in this 360-degree view of a landscape or, a depiction of a battle or something like that. These were really popular, these exhibitions, but they were expensive to produce because you needed to build a building to put them in. And so as a result, American and British artist entrepreneurs transformed the panoramic viewing experience by taking them out of the exhibition building and unrolling them in front of an audience. At a moving panorama, instead of strolling around a platform and taking in the 360 view, spectators occupied stationary positions and watched the large-scale paintings pass in front of them. They were typically rolled onto spindles and cranked slowly past the audience, giving them a sense of travel through time and space. And they were often guided in their journeys, the spectators were, by a lecturer narrating the sequence of images. And this is actually a patent drawing for a well-known panorama, John Banfard's trip down the Mississippi. And you can see on the left and the right here labeled A and B, those are the spindles and the crank mechanism that would move the image in front of the audience. Moving panoramas were much more profitable because they could be cheaply and widely exhibited. Artist entrepreneurs typically toured their shows from city to city, extending their stays if they were profitable and moving on if they weren't. Now, while living in Portland from 1846 to 1851, Pedro could have seen literally dozens of panoramas on all sorts of subjects. The Mexican War, trips down the Mississippi, biblical images. And one panorama in particular, I think, must have caught his attention. And that was Benjamin Russell and Caleb Purrington's whaling voyage round the world, which was exhibited in Portland during August and September of 1850. Now, this incredible object still survives. It's in the collections of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and it was on exhibit a couple of years ago. And it probably reenacted an early 1840s whaling voyage to the Pacific Ocean. It's extraordinary for its size. It's over 1,200 feet long and 8.5 feet tall. And it's also noteworthy for its detailed depictions of cities, villages, landscapes, and seascapes from New Bedford, around Cape Horn, and into the Pacific. And certainly images of Rio de Janeiro would have, in the whaling voyages panorama, would have piqued Pedro Tovookan's interest. In particular, Russell's depiction of 2 naval warships in Rio's harbor, one British and one American, could have reminded Pedro Tovookan of the US Navy's role in securing his freedom. Another moving panorama, perhaps equally compelling for Pedro Tovookan, was Henry Box Brown's Mirror of Slavery, shown as part of abolitionist performances between 1849 and 1851. Henry Box Brown had famously escaped from slavery by shipping himself in a crate from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia, and afterwards he moved to Massachusetts and became a popular speaker on the anti-slavery circuit, reenacting his emergence from the box on stage. And here you can see some images of Henry Box Brown there. He's coming out of the crate. Here's a detailed drawing of the crate itself. And this on the right is an advertisement for his panorama. In early 1850, working with the artist Josiah Walcott, Brown created a moving panorama of approximately 4 dozen scenes, which was described in the Liberator as, quote, an affecting delineation of slavery and the slave trade. Brown toured his panorama through a number of New England towns, including Providence, New Bedford, Worcester, and Portland, Maine. His innovative combination of abolitionist narrative and panoramic display captured the imagination of anti-slavery advocates in New England. Whether or not Pedro Tovookan would have seen the Mirror of Slavery, he, as well as George Gordon and Gordon's supporters, would surely have known about Brown's successful performances. Pedro Tovookan's banner not only responded to the imagery of moving panoramas, but his depictions of place were also shaped by popular print culture. In particular, his image of Boston, rendered very simply in a triangular format, topped with a stylized gold-domed building, would have been familiar to mid-19th century New England viewers. And whereas in the 18th century, views of Boston from the harbor typically emphasized the town's church spires, by the 19th century, it was the golden dome of Charles Bulfinch's 1798 Massachusetts State House that became Boston's iconic signifier. And so this is a view of Boston from the southeast, and you can see that triangular shape with the Massachusetts State House right at the top there. Lithographers depicting Boston from the harbor typically delineated the skyline as a gently sloping hill with the State House dome at its apogee. And this convention for depicting Boston was picked up by the early pictorial press, and specifically by Frederick Gleason for the first major American illustrated weekly, Gleason's Pictorial and Dining Room Companion. Now, Pedro Tovookan would have had easy access to the imagery in Gleason's during the 1850s. So these conventions, I have one more here. So I hope you can see the connection I'm making between Gleason's masthead here and what Pedro is portraying in his banner. So these conventions of mid-19th century commercial imagery, panoramas and illustrated newspapers, shaped Pedro's story into a narrative that would have been instantly recognizable to New Englanders. Bringing Rio de Janeiro, ocean-going ships, Boston's topographical profile, and a northern New England farmstead together in a panoramic format ultimately reinforced the imperialist context that brought Pedro Tovookan to New England in the first place. Art historian Denise Blake Olekshik argues that, quote, the panorama was a visual form that operated on both intellectual and somatic levels to convey ideologically powerful messages. She argues that their ability, that is to say the panorama's ability to compress space and time, caused viewers to engage in acts of visual possession that helped to naturalize or normalize imperialist goals. In the United States, moving panoramas depicting the Mississippi River, the landscapes of California and Mexican-American war battles, projected and normalized mid-19th century American imperialist ambitions. Similarly, and perhaps ironically, Pedro Tovookan's imagery linking Rio de Janeiro with shipping networks, New England's commercial capital, and its rural hinterland created a narrative that naturalized United States commercial and political involvement in Latin America, which of course rested largely on the slave economy. Pedro Tovookan didn't live to see the Civil War and emancipation. He died in April of 1860, and the Paris family bought a granite tombstone for him and buried him in the family cemetery. And it's interesting to me that the grave marker is a little bit worn as a result of probably acid rain. But it's interesting to me that the family put his African name on the grave marker, Pedro Tovookan. And it says just below, I'll read it for you, native of Zanzibar, Africa. And Zanzibar refers to, it's a 19th century geographical name for the coast of Mozambique. Died April 10th, 1860, age 27. So he didn't, again, he died, he didn't live to see the Civil War. And the family buried him in their family plot and erected a nice grave marker for him. Again, attesting to the ties that he had with the family. His banner and other family documents ultimately made their way into the collections of Historic New England, cultural preservation organization in Boston and around New England in the early 1980s, having stayed in the family until the 1980s and then sold to an art dealer. So Pedro Tovookan Paris survived the traumas of the transatlantic slave trade and recorded his experiences. His story was both extraordinary and depressingly ordinary. Of course, given the scale and duration of the transatlantic slave trade. What is so striking about Pedro's mentally by the swirl of mid-19th century North American commercial image, both and spectacle, but his tale of movement from slavery to freedom is all tightly bound to the places and the people that he knew. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. I think your screen just seconds ago may have frozen up. So maybe you're going, yeah, if you pull out and start over, I'm sure it'll be fine.
I'm back.
Yeah, we welcome you. We want you. There you are. Great, you're back. Terrific.
So I did everybody hear the end of my paper?
You might wrap it up one more time. I think we missed last minute.
Okay. So you saw the grave marker.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. So just to make the point that you know, he recorded his life story. And what's interesting, you know, as David, you well know, is that slave narratives were, you know, were the engine of abolition in some ways. But we don't have many that survive that are pictorial.
Right.
So that's really striking about this. And then the last point is that, you know, the banner was shaped by mid-19th century popular and commercial imagery. But at the same time, it's also very tightly bound to places and people that he knew, right? So, you know, the image of Rio is very striking. And then the image of that New England farmstead is the one with all the people in them. And they're clearly, you know, kind of signs of benevolence and protection in some ways. So, thank you.
Well, no, we welcome your questions out there, everybody. We have well over 50 people on the event, so please send in your questions that are coming in now. I want to ask you first. There probably is no way other than that very strange reminiscence to understand how this young man, Pedro Tovookan, reflected on the sheer scale of his life travels. I mean, if he's from East Africa, which means he came around the Horn to Brazil, makes sense if he's transported by the Portuguese, and then somehow all the way up to New England. I mean, he had been more than halfway around the world and ends up in this little farm in Maine. Right. I mean, that's my first question. I have a second one, though, and at least a second one, and that is, I'd love to hear more, if you know any more, about his role there in that 1856 campaign.
Yeah.
The idea that this Gordon, who's a know-nothing,
I know, yeah,
running the American ticket, appropriates this kid.
Right.
Well, he's no longer a kid at that point. He's 23 or something, 22.
Yeah, yep.
To go out and speak for him?
I know.
I mean, it's amazing. And you have the evidence, newspaper evidence, that he's actually used as an orator.
Yes.
By the know-nothing candidate trying to show some kind of abolitionist. I mean, what an old trick in American politics.
It's familiar, right?
But anyway, those are two questions to start with. But
yep.
Go ahead if you want.
Well, on the question of the scale of his travels, he was really young. Like, it's really difficult to understand, to know exactly how old he was. I'm not sure he really knew, and the evidence is contradictory, but he might have been as young as 10 when he was first kidnapped. And then, you know, David, it just must have been a nightmare, right? He's separated from his family. In fact, at least one of his brothers goes with him to the factory, right? The slave trading station. And we have evidence in court records, testimony of a cook on the Porpoise who says, you know, that they separated the enslaved people. Some went to the Porpoise and some went to the Kentucky. And this cook testifies that, and one boy, the one they call Pedro, was much affected because his brother went on the Kentucky. So, he's been, it's classic, he's sort of slowly stripped away from everything he knows. There's a mutiny on the Kentucky that's just horribly, brutally suppressed, which is what produces the cook's testimony, which I think Pedro must have witnessed because it happened while they were at the factory. And, it was, as I said, it was really brutal. So, and then, imagine he speaks some Portuguese, but not, I don't think that much really. So he's thrust into these negotiations in Rio about, is he free? Is he slave? Should he go to New England? And then, it's interesting. It may be why that last image is so particularly peopled, has so many particular figures, because it is the one place where he really sort of landed.
Closest thing he had to home, I mean, I guess.
Exactly. So anyway, I haven't found anything that, refers to whether he really, his thoughts about the scale of his travels at all.
No, I didn't think you could.
Yeah. I mean, but it's mind-boggling, right? And he's young.
Yeah.
And the participation in the campaign is, you're absolutely right, it's also extraordinary. And it is an interesting trick. So what Gordon is able to do is present himself as anti-slavery without really getting mired down in a sectional conflict, because he freed these slaves in Rio, right? So it's sort of removed from...
Everybody by then can agree that that Atlantic slave trade was horrible and evil. American slavery was still a problem.
And those Brazilians were Catholic, for God's sakes. So of course they're engaging in this terrible activity. I showed you the Daily Atlas coverage. There's other coverage in the papers, and not just in Boston. He appears in Lowell. And a lot is made of the fact that Virgil Paris, the head of household where he lives, is a Democrat. And so that's presented as, why are you giving us this man is surely a Democrat. He's just, standing up for you because of whatever, right? And again, the coverage in the other papers is, pretty disturbingly racist.
Well, just again, the irony that here's the know-nothing candidate, which call themselves the American Party, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, and so on and so forth. But you're right, by 56, they had to show something in the way of anti-slavery credentials, but they appropriate this very young African to go out on the, not a Black American, an African on the campaign trail. That's just amazing. I mean, God, you need to write a little stage play about that.
And it seems clear that Billy was also recruited. But I don't have any evidence that Billy, and there's no evidence in the press that he actually stood on stage the way Pedro did. And Billy is a bit of a mysterious figure. He's in New Hampshire with the relative of the judge until 1850, and then he disappears. And then in 1857, he's in the workhouse in Bridgewater. And he's there until the 1870s. And variously described as idiotic or, he's characterized as disabled in some way.
And he's younger than Tovookan, Billy.
That's a great question.
Oh, they don't know.
We assume so. We don't really know. They're about the same age.
Oh, okay.
There's that image I showed where Tovookan has a kind of protective arm around him.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's an amazing photograph. That's an astonishing photograph. Anyway, we're getting in now a bunch of questions here, and not surprisingly, in the realm of art history. Adam Aronson, my former PhD student, writes and asks, do you have evidence that that Tovookan actually saw a panorama on display? In other words, did he actually get to see one? Probably, it's hard to know probably, but he had to be aware of the phenomenon.
Hard to know, but you know what? So the family that he lived in, the Paris family, were consumers of popular entertainment. I know that. And in fact, they were a drawing family.
Oh,
We have images that are clearly in a different hand from Pedro Tovookan's, but images where they are, the kids are, drawing landscapes. So
sure.
that's super interesting to me. And in fact, there's a letter in the family that says, the school teacher came and wanted to borrow your scenery. Can I let them have it? And the brother Edward writes back and says, no, that's my scenery. So clearly they are sort of producing images. They're an image producing family, which is not that unusual for the 1840s and 50s.
Yeah.
But these exhibitions were so popular that
And he would have been back and forth
anybody.
to Portland, no? Because Portland is a significant city. I mean,
Yes,
it's a big
yes.
port city.
And it
So,
was easy to get to Portland on the train.
yeah.
One of the things that Pedro does when he's sort of in the 1850s to make money is he sells oysters at parties and things. He's a sort of a caterer, yeah. And so those must have come from Portland. And given the relationship between oyster selling and African Americans, I think that he either retained or established ties to the African American community in Portland. But yeah, everybody went to see panoramas. It was the thing to do.
Oh,
It really.
yeah.
So the answer is no, I don't have evidence, but
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear that he would have.
There's a question about whether Pedro Tovookan is the actual painter of this piece, or if he had help, or any evidence around that, or.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's come up a lot, and I've thought about it a lot, and particularly when I realized that the family was a drawing family, that made me nervous.
Sure.
And we have images that were done.
Clearly his story, however it was executed.
Yes, well, and the drawing has very unusual elements to it. The image of Rio, has an enormous and mostly flat depiction of what's a fountain. It was a fountain in the harbor of Rio, and then has this weird attempt at linear perspective, at one point perspective. He shows a street sort of going into the background. And then, particularly the last image, the ship, I think all young boys in New England ports drew pictures of ships. It's what they did. You see them as graffiti in New England meeting houses.
Yeah.
So that's not unusual to me. But the last image of the farmstead with the woman way out of scale, and then the two images as kind of gateposts, those are very unusual, and would not, that kind of composition, it's not really in the kind of Western canon, right?
No, that's not done in a studio down in Portland.
No, and it wouldn't have been taught. That wouldn't have been taught to a young a student, who's taking painting lessons in Paris, Maine. The incorporation of perspective is interesting because that is a Western, pictorial strategy, and so that may come from some sort of training or suggestions from the other kids in the family. It's a great question. I'm pretty convinced that it's Pedro, mostly that it's Pedro's hand.
Right. Well, there's another question here related to that. Is there evidence on the object itself, tack holes and so on, that it had been traveled or displayed?
Yeah, that is a great question. There are
edges or
Yep. There are holes along the top. There's a very interesting seam in the middle. So the ship is very close to a seam down the middle. And I've wondered, it's funny to me that there's no depiction of Gordon, right? Like if this is a campaign banner for Gordon, where is he? And it seems to me that you would have had, Pedro Tovookan would have put an image of that. There was this back and forthing in Rio as to whether or not he was Fonseca's slave or he was free or whatever. And that moment was very dramatic. and I would have thought that Pedro would have included that. I've sometimes wondered if maybe that got cut out and given to Gordon
Yeah.
as some sort of, I don't know, souvenir or something. The Gordon family, I've tracked them down and they don't have anything from, from George Gordon. So I don't know, maybe there are more images out there, which would be fantastic.
Yeah, he might have done a separate one for Gordon's campaign. Who knows? Boy, keep looking for that one. Ooh.
Yeah.
Julia Furtado has a couple of interesting questions. First of all, congratulate you on this original and great presentation. Why do you think, what might be a reason to erase his African past? That is, the panorama doesn't include the African past. Did it somehow, would that have, she's asking here, does that somehow fit an abolition discourse? Freed. Yep. He's freed. He's not the African slave. And then there's also the question here: have you managed to look at East African sources, Zanzibar, and so on and so on?
Yep.
Beak and so on. So there's two questions in there.
Yeah, great. So I think that really the focus of the panorama is on that moment in Rio. And it's because it's focused on George Gordon and what he did for Pedro Tovookan.
Right.
And that's why I think, we can't really talk about this as purely an autobiography. It's a political polemic. So I think that's the reason to leave out the African experience and the experience of the Middle Passage. And I think, again, that was such a horrific experience that it's hard to know how, and an experience he had as a very young boy, hard to know how he might have depicted that, right? So what does he show? He shows, the buildings of Rio, he shows a ship, and then he shows a very kind of abstracted view of Boston, and then a more detailed image of the Paris homestead. So those are
those troops in Rio are
interesting. I know, interesting, right?
He would remember them. I guess you would as a boy.
Yes, right.
I mean, wow. We got a couple of.
Let me just answer Junior's comment on Brazilian archives. I actually haven't gone to Rio and looked at the archives, but the fantastic opportunity that working at Gilder Lehrman gave me was to really dig into the East African side. And there's wonderful scholarship on East Africa that I've had the chance now to take a close look at. I'm struggling with Portuguese between my college French and my tourist Italian and my Duolingo Portuguese and Google Translate. It's a lot easier now.
See, we should have kept you here because we have a variety of Brazilians around this term.
Oh, great. Well, I'll come back. I'll come back anytime, David.
Daniel's relatives are from Portugal and he speaks some Portuguese too. So you could have hired Daniel.
I could have.
Anyway, you see the question.
And then, sorry, I'm reading Junia's comment. She says the comment is that coast of Zanzibar is usually north of Mozambique, right? Yeah. So the term on his gravestone is Zanquebar, Zanquebar, which is a term that's no longer used, and it just refers to that southern coast of, as I understand it, of Mozambique. Percival, in his memoir, says that Pedro goes to Zanzibar, right, which is where the Omanis at this point were basically controlling the slave trade. I think that's wrong. He describes Zanzibar as a small island in the Mozambique Channel, and Zanzibar is not in the Mozambique Channel, and it's not a small island.
Further north.
Yeah. But the island of Mozambique is in the Mozambique Channel and is a small island and was the center for Portuguese slave trading in Mozambique during this time. Right. This is all stuff that I've put together, thanks to Gilder Lehrman. So yeah, that's the answer about the coast. But I would love
Got
to.
other art history questions there. If you,
Okay,
you can
yep.
read these, I think. I don't know if you want to take Shirley Watch Us or.
Sure, Shirley Vida, my old friend.
Oh, okay.
The relationship in the images of neoclassicism and romanticism. Huh. Seeing some drawing manual sources in the banners. That's a great question. I'm wondering, and surely I will contact you for help with this, because I think you've done a lot of work in drawing manuals. I'm particularly interested again in the way that he's trying to achieve a kind of perspective there. And I assume that's what you mean about the neoclassicism and the images of the fountain in Rio, and then Boston, and then of course the very romantic image of the farmstead. Yeah, it's an interesting mashup, right, of different traditions right there in the banner. And I do wonder if it has to do with the fact that the Paris family were a kind of drawing family, that they were people who engaged in drawing materials. Any library that had been in the house is no longer, I can't, it's gone, it's dispersed. And I've asked the family, there are members of the Paris family that are still living in Paris, I've asked them about drawing manuals, and they didn't have any in their home, but that's not to say that they couldn't have engaged with them.
Well, let's take one or so more here. I think Audie Van Dyke is getting at the jurisdiction of the slave trade. Now, maybe she means, the slave trade was abolished by this point in the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, French Empire, and so on, but not the Portuguese, as I understand it. So he's on a legal ship, I take it.
No, because it's an American ship with an American captain.
And that's not a legal ship.
That is not legal.
Yeah, no,
and they go to huge lengths to disguise the
product
fact
of the illegal slave trade.
Yes. Yes. So the Rio slave traders and the Americans who were participating illegally go to enormous lengths to disguise the fact that they are slave trading. And so
we don't always think of Maine as part of this Atlantic slave trade. We certainly Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts to some degree, but Maine.
Yes. And the Kentucky was also from Maine. We do have this again, we have this kind of mythos of New England as being a bastion of anti-slavery, and, it just wasn't. And Maine, although it had early, abolitionist activities, the vast majority of the population were not really pro-abolition.
No.
And, you can see that in the coverage of the trial of Captain Libby's trial. And you've asked, why did he bring with him just these two boys? So it's a really interesting question. The Porpoise is a smaller boat. It's a tender to the Kentucky. So the Kentucky was jam-packed with enslaved people, and the Kentucky doesn't end up going into Rio Harbor. It actually goes south and unloads the cargo, including presumably Pedro's brother. And so there were actually 3 boys on the Porpoise. And I think they would have been, they spoke Portuguese. So I think they would have been maybe being groomed for some sort of household position or clerk, some sort of work that didn't involve that involved a kind of closeness with their enslavers. So the third boy, Luis, manages to slip away in Rio, and then there were only 2 African boys who are on the Porpoise, and it's Gordon who commandeers the Porpoise, sequesters the crew and the 2 boys, and then has actually one of the sailors from the Raritan sail the ship up to Boston. I think that answers the question.
Martha, has this extraordinary painting banner, has it been displayed? Has there been a show about it? Has it traveled? I mean,
There hasn't been a show specifically about the banner. Historic New England had an exhibition, which is where I first saw it. My friend was the curator, Nancy Carlisle at Historic New England was the curator of the exhibition. It was a sort of general exhibition of their collections. And then it was also on view as part of a folk art exhibit at Colby College in their wonderful art museum. And, you know, there's this whole category of folk art, which can be kind of problematic. But no, and I think, you know, I've found so much material that it would be really terrific to do an exhibit. So I'll have to talk to.
No, I think that's got to happen out of this book.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, and
That would
maybe
be
even
great.
travel it if you can. I mean, that's,
Maybe even what?
maybe even travel it around if you can.
Yeah,
I mean,
that'd be terrific.
extraordinary work. I mean, it's just amazing. How did he die? Do we know?
So they say he died of pneumonia. And, you know, one of the members of the family, so the Paris had an extended kinship network in Paris, Maine. And the wife of the head of household, Columbia, had two of her sisters who lived in adjacent houses. And one of them kept a diary. And so you can track sort of Pedro and what he's doing, partially through that diary, and then another diary. These people wrote a lot, another diary of a neighbor, but it's very poignant. You know, she, over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, she's in and out of the Paris household and says, you know, records, you know, been to Mr. Paris's house, Pedro very ill, you know, Pedro somewhat better, and then finally he dies. So yeah, he died of pneumonia.
Well, one last question. There's a question here about the ships. Were they New England built?
Yes.
So American built, New England built ships.
Yes, exactly. And the ship was actually owned by a man named George Richardson. And George Richardson was from Gorham, Maine. And he ran his business partially out of New Orleans. And he travels back to Portland to testify in Libby's favor. Basically was going to say, you know, it's my ship and I had no idea that they were slaving and I don't know who these Fonseca people are. But he dies on the way back. I assume he dies of, you know, yellow fever. I don't know, something. But he literally dies as he's traveling back, which was I'm sure, a huge blow to Cyrus Libby. So yeah, these are Maine-built ships. The Porpoise was built in Brunswick. I don't remember where the Kentucky was built, maybe up in Penobscot.
So it's a slave trade story, but my God, it involves Brazil.
I know.
The Portuguese, but especially it's an American story.
Yes.
In New England built slave ships.
And David, you know, I'm so interested in what Pedro's experience was like in Western Maine. You know, he clearly had this very close relationship with the family, but, you know, there's evidence that he was never encouraged or allowed to establish a kind of independence. And I haven't quite nailed that down yet, but
formal education that we know of.
So Percival says that the family taught him to read and write, but I have evidence that he was able to write before he went into the household. He could, in the court records for the Libby trial, there's the list of the witnesses signing off to be paid a per diem, and Pedro very beautifully writes his name, whereas a bunch of the other sailors make their marks. So that's super interesting. You know, the Percival memoir is super helpful, but also problematic. And I want to give a shout out to Charles Riley, who's a librarian who I met at Gilder Lehrman. He's a librarian at Yale, was super helpful. He's a linguist and helped me identify possibly the origin of some fragments of song that appear in Percival's memoir.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really great.
I love hearing these stories about the the quiet, unseen, heroic librarian.
Yes.
One last little question. You can
Yeah.
do with it whatever you wish. Is this a normal kind of research for an art historian? Or has this taken you on some paths you hadn't quite been on before? Because the detective work you're doing is just absolutely fascinating to just a regular historian.
So I'm trained in American Studies.
Yeah, right.
So that helps me sort of go back and forth. And then, as you said, my first book was on courthouses in Massachusetts in the 18th and 19th century. So I'm familiar with court documents. So that wasn't unusual. What's been really a new move for me, David, is the East African piece, which again, I'm so grateful to have been given the box of time and resources to track all that stuff down when I was down at
That whole Indian Ocean
it's amazing.
Another universe. It's another slave trade in the Indian Ocean. There's evidence it was in sheer scale over time as big as the Atlantic.
Yep. But in terms of an art historical approach, I do a kind of formal analysis. I try to understand the composition of the image. And then, and also placing it in its pictorial context, its larger pictorial context. So the panoramas and the illustrated newspapers, those are sort of art historical tools of the trade, it seems to me.
Well, from the sublime to a wonderful little fact, Lawrence Feynman writes in to remind us that Hannibal Hamlin was from Paris, Maine. Hannibal Hamlin was Lincoln's vice president. So
indeed he was, and he was related to the Parises.
Oh, of course. Well, everybody in Paris was probably related.
That's right, except I don't know how the politics worked, because Virgil Paris was, what do they call him, a water-carrying Democrat or something like that.
That's a good, I haven't heard that line. That's
something like that. I'll dig it up for you.
Oh, not just a dough-faced Democrat.
Yes, no, not dough-faced, but
oh my God,
water carrying.
No, I want to write I want you to write a play about that 56 campaign with Tovookan. I don't know, man.
Wouldn't that be great?
Just too good a story. Well, listen, we've kind of run out of time, but we had great questions. And Martha, thank you for this talk, exposing this story for us. And good luck as you continue to write this book, and come back anytime.
Thank you. And I will come back. I miss you all down there. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for doing this. And thanks to everybody for coming today. It was a great audience.
Thank you all.